And perhaps more importantly, it was public. It was in the Wall Street Journal. And it gave a validation to the value of photography, unlike it had had before. The Getty Museum spent $30 million on buying photographs. There must be something right with photography.
That was Howard Greenberg, founder of the Center for Photography Woodstock and Howard Greenberg Gallery, New York, telling me about one of the defining moments that changed how photography is viewed as an art form. It's one of many stories he shares with me today in the third episode of my 7-part collaborative series with AIPAD in the lead up to the 2025 edition of the Photography Show, the oldest and longest running art fair for photography, which takes place from the 23rd until the 27th of April at the Park Avenue Armory in New York City. Throughout April, I'll be speaking with AIPAD members, past and present, about the history of the organisation and how the market for photography has grown and evolved over the past 50 years. My guest today is Howard Greenberg, one of the world's leading photography dealers. An authority on 19th and 20th century photography, he's one of the key figures responsible for establishing photography's value in the art market. We speak about his early days in Woodstock as a newspaper photographer, which ignited a passion for the history of photography and collecting photographs, to becoming a photography dealer, opening a gallery in New York, and being one of a handful of passionate individuals who changed the way photography is viewed as a medium. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome to the program. You're listening to Subtext Discourse Art World podcast, highlighting unique perspectives on contemporary art and photography. I'm your host, Michael Dooney. Now, without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Howard Greenberg. Yeah, maybe we can start at the very beginning. Like, when was it that you first held a camera and thought, this is it?
Sure. Well, I'll try and give you the short version, or else we'll be here into the night, and maybe even tomorrow. So basically, I went to school not to be a photographer or anything like that. I was in a PhD clinical psychology program. However, I never really started it because there was this thing called Vietnam going on at the same time, and I had to deal with that. It took me a while to deal with that. I didn't go to Vietnam, but the threat was there. And I wound up getting a camera. I had a girlfriend who was a photography student, and my best old friend who I moved in with back in Brooklyn after college. He had taken some photography courses. So when my mother's friend went to Japan and asked me what I wanted, I said, I'll take a Pentax Spotmatic, which was my first camera, $150. And I started making photographs and literally never turned back. I was hooked from the first roll of film that I put through the camera. And not long after I got that camera, I moved upstate to Woodstock. That was in 1972, and immediately got a job as the photographer for the Woodstock Times, which was a fairly new newspaper at that point. And I did all the photography, and I developed and printed for the other staff people for $15 a week. And, there I was, a photographer. But it was great because I became immersed in Woodstock and its history, which I discovered fascinating, wonderful history, beginning as an art colony in 1902, and still with not just great musicians, left over more or less from the festival, but just an amazing array of creative people, artists, sculptors, writers, architects, all kinds of people, publishers. Everybody was there in Woodstock. And a lot of the people back in the 1970s had been there for years and years. So it was kind of living history. And that led me to becoming very interested, immersed into the history of photography. I did an exhibition in 1976 at the Artists Association called The Photographic History of Woodstock. And I discovered photographers like Eva Watson-Schutze, who had been in the Photo Secession and was published by Stieglitz in camera work. She lived in Woodstock. She was gone at that point, but she lived there, and her husband's second wife had all her beautiful platinum print photographs from the turn of the century. And these kind of things happened. Russell Lee, the FSA photographer, had lived there, and his work was left behind in Woodstock. So it was a great place for me to discover not only the history of the place, but to discover incredible photography, and jump into the history of photography. And that's more or less how it happened. I morphed from being a photographer to starting the Photography Center in Woodstock, was just still going on today. And that was about 1977. I couldn't both be a photographer and do the center, so I went towards that. And that sort of gently morphed into my opening my own gallery around the corner from the Photography Center in 1981. And that was called Find Gallery, because that's what I used to do, was find photographs, old photographs. And that was the start of it all, really.
I mean, you kind of condensed the 1970s then. How many other people around you had the same level of enthusiasm for photography?
Well, there were others. I mean, you could say the modern gallery scene began probably in 1969 with the Whitkin Gallery, and then Light Gallery opened in, I believe, 1971. And then you had other small galleries popping up around that time, maybe a little after. Margin Eikrug, Marcuse Pfeiffer, Sonnabend Gallery, which was painting and photography gallery, or they had a photography program. And there were others. So the labs had galleries and so on. So there was a scene. It was going on in the 70s. And my habit was to go down to New York about once a month, sometimes just for the day. Sometimes I'd stay overnight at my parents' house in Brooklyn. And my goal was simply to see every photography show there was. And I could usually do that within a half day, maybe a whole day at most. And it was great. It was great because for me, I would learn so much, not just by seeing the shows, but by ending my days always at the permanent collection of photography, the hanging of the permanent collection at MOMA, Museum Modern Art, which in those days, the curator was John Szarkowski. And it was looking at those photographs more than anything that really turned me on. It turned me on for my own photography to understanding how photography was really both the print and the image. You make the photograph, but then you make the print. And the magic for me really came out in the printmaking. So that was really my initial turn on. And when I, as I say, morphed into first the Photography Center, then my own gallery, it was that kind of thinking, my passion for photographic printmaking and the materials from, let's say, the 1960s and before were very different than what was available to me as a photographer, and other photographers in the 70s. So I was discovering also the beautiful papers, whether they were silver papers or platinum papers or bromide papers or whatever the process was. There was an incredible variety of beautiful photographic paper that made prints that, for me, were, I would drool over them. And so that was very important to me in the beginning. And I think most, perhaps all of us who began around them would say more or less the same thing. Photography was always, for us, now it's called traditional photography, but it was always a medium of the picture and the print.
Yeah. And at the Center for Photography and your gallery, were you showing your contemporaries, like the people that were living and making work then, or were you showing what now would be vintage?
That's a good question. In the beginning, I made it a point not to sell contemporary photography.
Okay.
And I did it for two reasons. Number one, I was so much discovering and loving the history of photography. That's where my interest really was. But more than that, it was because I knew a lot of photographers.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't want to be stuck in a position of being responsible for my peers, for my friends. Yes. I really didn't, Yeah. It's like, I'm not
show
so
my
sure.
work, keep it a gallery.
Right. And I still have to deal with that kind of thing quite a bit. And the photography, of course, now it does show younger. It's just starting to show young photographers. But, for a long time, it's been showing living photographers, generally over 50, but not by design. Anyway, so, in the beginning, it was, as I say, it was really the history and those beautiful objects that I wanted to, work with, discover, sell, whatever it took.
And so I guess starting a gallery is different to starting a center for photography because one's a non-for-profit, the other one is essentially a commercial business.
That's true.
Were there then people that were interested in buying photographs?
No, well, when I started the center, that's 1977, I was just really in the throes of discovering old photography, vintage photography for myself. I was still a photographer when I started the center, and already part of a small community in the Hudson Valley of photographers who knew each other and always looking for reasons to get together, and some comradeship and all that. So when I started the photography center, it was around that idea. We showed both my first exhibition at the photography center was Paul Strand and Walker Evans. You can't get much more. They were portfolios. They weren't like slews of great vintage prints, but it didn't matter because there was very little way that any of, this community of interested photographers could see that kind of work without going to a show in a museum in New York or somewhere else.
Yes.
So there was appreciation for showing great photography, and we were very conscious of keeping the standards high. We wanted to show, classic good stuff, or sometimes contemporary that we thought was really viable. For instance, we gave Peter Hujar one of his first exhibitions ever, if you can believe that. I remember calling him, and he was shocked. He said, "Who are you? And why do you want to show my photographs?" True. So we did have some contemporary photographers showing there also. But for me, it was all about just great photography. And that's all I cared about. And I loved the history. So there was a lot of that.
And so in the context of New York then, was the MoMA one of the only places you can go and see photographic exhibitions like within the country?
No, there were others. I mean, ICP was there at that point. They had the mansion uptown, and they started at, I forget what, 74, 76 maybe, something like that. And the Met would have photography shows. I don't think with regularity, but they had photography shows. NYU, Gray Art Gallery, I think they did shows of photography from time to time. There were other places to see it. You had to look hard. The New York Times, though, always had a photography reviewer. In the early days, it was a guy named Jake Deschen. But along with the reviews, they would have a listing. It was about, I don't know, people listening can't see my fingers, but, I've got about a 3-inch spread. And that was the listing of all the photography shows in New York. And that was kind of my Bible, because they would list wherever photographs were on the walls. Yeah, and that was it, yeah.
So you opened your space in 1981, is that right?
I opened my first commercial gallery, if you will, in 81, yeah.
And was that in Woodstock?
I was in Woodstock, and it lasted 5 years, and then I opened in Soho in 86.
And what prompted the move from Woodstock to Soho?
Well, during the Woodstock years, I did quite a bit of traveling. I kept the gallery open about half a year, and then in the wintertime, I would travel, like full of Bushman, with a couple boxes of photographs, and I'd go to various cities where I could connect, usually if there was a museum with a photography department curator, through the curator, I could connect to their very small communities of support and meet people who might collect photography or want to collect photography, things like that. So I did a lot of traveling in those early years, especially the first 5, San Francisco, Houston, Chicago, Atlanta, several other places. And from time to time, I would travel with Larry Miller, Lawrence Miller Gallery. Okay. And he's one of the, cadre of early guys in this game, if you will. And Larry and I traveled a bunch of times and got very friendly. And he opened a gallery, took a space on Spring Street in Worcester in 1986. And he was obliged to take the entire floor, which was not a very large floor, but he was a little bit insecure about meeting the rent. So he lopped off about a third of the floor and offered it to me if I wanted to open a gallery in New York.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah, the timing was perfect. I had just divorced with my first wife, and so I was free, and his price was $900 a month, which I thought I could handle, even though it was a very small space. So I did it. I opened PhotoFind and put my name on it, so it was PhotoFind/Howard Greenberg.
Oh, okay.
In 1986 on Spring and Worcester, yeah.
And at the time, what was the gallery landscape in New York like? Like, were there many other galleries?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, how many? How many regular photography galleries in New York when I moved down in 86? I don't know for sure, but there were at least 10 or 15.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, there were plenty of people showing photographs. And I'm including a few painting galleries that had a program with photography as well. But yeah, it was already happening. I wasn't the first one there.
Oh, okay.
It was early, in the scene, and we were still building the market at that point. It was far from what it became.
Yeah.
But there was a scene. Yeah, I remember, I'll tell a little story, which always meant something to me. I knew Peter McGill. We all knew each other, and I knew pretty much all the photo dealers just from coming down that once a month and getting around and, talking and looking at people. And some people had already known about the photography center at that point. So when I decided to take this space from Larry and I was going to open a gallery, I went up to Peter's one day and sat with him. And I said, Pete, I don't know how you're going to take this, but I'm going to open I'm thinking of opening a gallery in New York. And I didn't know how he would react. He might see it as competition or whatever. But to my surprise, and really I was very, very happy about it, he got incredibly enthusiastic. He said, that's incredible. Good. That's great. I'm so glad you're doing it. We need more good galleries in New York.
Wow.
That was his reaction, And so that encouraged me, fantastic. And it also reminds me that, yes, there were a bunch of galleries in New York, but not so many, that he wouldn't encourage me to open because, quote, we need more.
Yeah, interesting. Because a few years prior to you moving down, AIPAD was founded, wasn't it? We're speaking in the context of AIPAD at the moment, so the Association for International Photography Art Dealers. When did you become a member?
I think I became an official member either 83 or 84. I was actually asked to be on the board pretty much after I became, or maybe at the same time I became a member.
Oh,
Again,
okay.
it was a small industry back then. AIPAD had wonderful beginnings. I mean, there were good people from all over. I don't remember everybody, but people like Steve White from LA and Harry Lunn and Gusi Pfeiffer became president at first, and a bunch of others. Sorry if I'm forgetting your names. But I think it was Casper Fleischmann from Zurich. He might have been on at that point also. Anyway, the idea was to somehow let the world know that photographic art was worth something and worthwhile to have in museums and in private collections and so on. And it was an organization that formed to promote itself, to promote the art of photography as collectible, if you might say, as much as any other medium of art. We had great ideas. We talked about insurance, group insurance for everyone. We talked about education a lot. And indeed, I think for a while we had a small brochure, but the original intention was to expand it into some sort of a book about collecting photography and then programming. And of course, the fair, AIPAD Fair, came out of that and so on. I mean, it was a very relevant group at the beginning to do what we could to expand the industry.
Yeah. Speaking of AIPAD, this episode is brought to you by AIPAD and the Photography Show. AIPAD represents fine art photography galleries around the world and is proud to present the 2025 edition of its flagship event, the Photography Show. The art fair will showcase photography from the earliest processes to cutting-edge contemporary work that pushes the boundaries of the medium. From April 23 until 27 at the Park Avenue Armory in New York City, go to www.aipad.com/show for more information and to plan your visit. You mentioned Harry Lunn, and when I spoke with the past presidents, I also had read about him beforehand. How significant a figure was Harry?
Well, Harry was an important figure, to say the least. He wasn't the only one, but Harry was, larger than life? In that he was a very large man with a very deep, booming voice and had the sense and the belief in himself that he could control the photography business one way or another. He really did. He was powerful.
Yeah.
and he had money somehow to back it up. And in those days, none of us had much money to do anything. So Harry became a force. He got into the business sort of by accident. He had famously was in the CIA.
I've read
And
that. Yeah.
yeah, and part of his front was not part. I guess his front was a company called Graphics International, and he had galleries in Washington D.C. and I think Paris. I don't know if he actually had a gallery in Paris. And as the story goes, I never talked to him about it, but apparently he was in Washington and he saw a line around the corner, long line. And he checked in, and it was a show of Ansel Adams photographs.
Okay.
And he checked it out and thought to himself, oh, this is interesting. Maybe I'm missing out on something. I can do this and that. And that's how he started in photography. And he came in and he wheeled and dealed and bought a lot of archives and collections and became extremely powerful from the point of view that he had so much material and he controlled the market in many ways. In the auctions, his presence was omnipotent. He was omnipotent. If Harry wanted to buy something, he would stand in the back, he'd raise his hand high, and he just wouldn't put it down until he bought it. So,
Wow.
you had to go against him, which he didn't want to do ever. And at the same time, Harry, and this came partly from need, he was very generous and really made a big difference in the lives of many of we young dealers. In that, first of all, a couple of young dealers worked for him in the beginning as assistants, but beyond that, he would fairly freely consign out material. He had just acquired the Walker Evans estate. He had a great Walker Evans. He had this, he had that. And many of the young dealers then, Jeffrey Frankel, myself, Bob Mann, who worked for him, and a number of others, were able to get good material and then take it out and try and sell it because Harry was willing to do that. And he had an interesting way. He didn't bother you. I mean, he'd write it down on paper, and then you wouldn't hear anything about it for maybe 6 months or a year even. And then if he needed money, he'd get on the phone. What do you have for me? Do you owe me any money? And it was interesting how it worked with Harry. So he had I dare say, he had a dark side and a light side.
Yeah.
And he could be a real tough customer, but he could also make a difference in your life in the most positive way. So, that was Harry. What can I tell you? We all owe, in one way or another, debt of gratitude to him because he was so very responsible for getting great work, important work, and then putting it out into the market, in all the different ways that he did it.
You mentioned how he was helping a lot of younger dealers, and I guess you would have been in your 20s or early 30s when you were having the gallery.
Well, I actually opened my gallery a bit later than some of the others because I had started the center and I was up in Woodstock. I wasn't in the New York scene, if you will. I didn't work for Light Gallery. A lot of the early dealers did. So I was a bit Johnny-come-lately. And when I opened my gallery in Woodstock, I was already 32.
Wow, okay.
So, yeah. I mean, as I said, I had to go through some changes in life. I didn't go right into photography or right after college. It took a while. But of course, once I jumped in, there was no stopping me.
No turning back, yeah.
I couldn't possibly accept doing anything else in my life, so that was that. But yeah, so when I opened the gallery in New York, I was already, it was 86. I was already 38.
Yeah.
When I first opened Photo Fine on Spring Street, yeah.
The reason I asked was, who was your clientele? Were they old? Were they older, or they were younger?
Who was my clientele? Anybody who I can grab off the street who was remotely interested in looking at a photograph. That was my clientele. No, not quite. Well, there were certain museums around the country that were starting to collect, or a few already had collections. They were clients. Yeah. As I said before, I traveled a lot throughout the 80s.
Yeah, you did.
And I made wonderful clients outside of New York. To this day, some of them are still clients. But that was actually one of the most enjoyable parts of the business for me, was traveling with pictures and meeting with all kinds of really wonderful and interesting people who were happy to see you, who were happy to see what you had in your box. And if they could afford it, were very willing to buy some photographs. That was essential for me to develop a clientele, because a lot of those people would sooner or later come to New York, and they would come to the gallery, and then they'll see more pictures. As far as New York goes, well, we did shows. They were in the press. We sent out invitations. We were there and available. So I didn't really ever do much cold calling or things like that. We just put the pictures on the wall, promoted it as much as possible, and people would come in. And eventually, again, in those days, there weren't that many collectors. Eventually, pretty much all of them would come by, whether they bought or not, So that's pretty much how it happened. You meet people also, I should mention, and a lot of the dealers would meet people in auction. There's a lot of people buying photographs in the early days only knew about the auctions and only maybe trusted the auctions as a fair place to buy pictures. But you meet people. I met some of my best clients and some of my long-standing friends sitting next to them in an auction. So that was important as well.
Yeah, I think I didn't realize, when I had MySpace, how different it is and how the work that comes to auction, but the people that are going to auctions now are quite different than the people that you're seeing going to galleries and going to openings. And they have very different goals, perhaps, than a normal person that's just going in to see shows.
I think that's true. But, in New York, Sotheby's, Christie's, Phillips now, there are no live auctions anymore.
Yeah.
They're doing almost everything online or integrating some photographs into contemporary art auctions. And so those days are pretty much over also.
Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, for me, it was probably 10 years ago that I was going, and I thought, wow, it was really eye-opening, actually.
Yeah, 10 years ago, yes. The auctions were great. First of all, it was a social event.
Yeah.
It was a way to catch up with a lot of people. You'd see colleagues and people in the business, you'd see them there and you'd have your chit chat and da-da-da-da. And that was nice, And then also the auctions, especially early on, not so much later, but they really were a barometer of the market. You'd have a good feeling for what was going on in the photography market by sitting through one or two auctions.
Oh, interesting.
And, now online and stuff, you don't know what's going on. I mean, you see the results, that gives you an idea, of course, but it's a very different kind of barometer out there now for the photography market. And as I say, for years and years, the auctions were super important to understand what was going on in the market.
Yeah, I think when I've spoke to other auctioneers, they were saying in the early days, you would know who all the collectors were. And in the room, you would know who all of the people are that have come to buy. That's Whereas in the later years, when it was all online, you have no idea who's buying anything anymore.
That's true. It's fun sometimes to look through old catalogs. I don't do that often, but if I pull out a catalog, say from 1993 in Christie's, because now I know online that something I'm researching is in that catalog, and then I start thumbing, I see all my notes.
Yeah.
And I've written down who's bought what picture. Not every picture, because you couldn't always see, but enough that those notes back then were very important to know who was doing what, collectors and dealers, Yeah, absolutely.
So going back to the gallery in New York and that period, I guess the 80s leading into the 90s, was there a turning point for when all of a sudden things were, or was there a moment in time around then when it felt like all the work that I suppose yourself, AIPAD, Harry, and the others around, the wave was building up?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think most of us who've been around that long would say the same thing. The real watershed moment was when the Getty Museum started collecting.
And when was that?
1984.
Oh, okay.
And it was an interesting moment how it all came together. The short version, a man named Daniel Wolf had one of the good galleries in New York at that point. His family was from Houston, well-connected socially and stuff. And at a party of some sort, he was talking to the man who was the head of the Getty Museum and suggested the idea that maybe the Getty should collect photographs and that he could help them acquire the best of the best that's out there. I'm not sure if I have that exactly right, but it's close enough.
Yeah.
And that led to that led to a very interesting thing. So Daniel, with the help of a man who was curator at the Met at that time, and his brother, started secretly. When I say secretly, he never told people what it was for, but he contacted the biggest collectors in the world at that point, many of the dealers, to try and gather up collections, great material for we didn't know what at the beginning. We weren't sure. It was going to be a new museum, a big collection. Well, that activity went on, and the Getty, in a short period of time, spent supposedly $30 million acquiring, by far the most important and best collection of photography in an instant.
Yeah.
What it also did was spread a lot of that money into the hands of dealers. I was one, and there were several others. And suddenly, we had some money to spend.
Yeah, absolutely.
And suddenly, we could go out there and spend more and create more activity. And perhaps more importantly, it was public. It was in the Wall Street Journal. And it gave a validation to the value of photography, unlike it had had before. The Getty Museum spent $30 million on buying photographs. There must be something right with photography.
Yeah.
And that was, I think, that was a sea change in the market. That was a big deal.
Absolutely.
And for both reasons. And basically, it only got better from there.
Yeah, I guess for all of you guys that had been kind of plugging away through the 70s, that must have felt incredible.
It was great. It was also strange because we didn't know what was going on while it was happening. But it certainly was great to have the opportunity to make these large sales. And, we were so, how should I say, the market was so small, and most of we younger guys were not coming from any money, really.
Yeah.
So, if you sold a photograph for $1,000, it was a big deal. And you could keep going for another week or two, stuff like that. So suddenly the ante was up, and it benefited everyone.
Yeah, wow. You mentioned before that the 90s you felt like was your golden era when you were in New York.
Mm-hmm.
What about it made it special?
Well, for me, for my gallery, we moved from Spring and Worcester to Prince and Worcester in 91. But that space at the time was large. It was a large photography gallery. By today's standards, not so large. But it was beautiful gallery. I had made a really nice sale to the Tokyo Metropolitan Museum of Art. And this was the point, 89, 90, the Japanese were collecting in droves. They were filling up their museums with photography.
Okay.
And I was working with Eiko Hosoi. And Eiko and I were very close, and he helped me make a lot of sales in Japan. And I had tucked away some money from one big sale for my next gallery, so I was able to build a really nice space, and I had the money to put into it. So I had a nice gallery, and things were going well anyway. But what happened, for some reason, all the photography that I was showing, and a lot of that was discovery. A lot of the photographers I was showing then were really their first shows. And a couple of more famous ones like William Klein, he came to me in 1991, and it just was a confluence of events that was attracting attention. And the reviewers at the New York Times, a guy named Chuck Hagan and Margaret Loke, I remember. There was some Andy Grunberg from time to time and Vicky Goldberg. They were really noticing what the gallery was doing. They were, I think, enjoying the kinds of exhibitions I was putting on because they were good, and they were expanding what we knew about photography and who was out there photographing and all that kind of thing. So I was getting reviewed pretty much every exhibition with, a large review in the New York Times with pictures and other magazines and so on. So the gallery became famous in the photo world. It really became well known during that 10-year period. And concurrently, the industry was growing and growing. The prices were getting higher and higher. And I was right there in the mix. So, that's why I call them my glory years. That 10 to 15 years or so was probably the best time for the photography market and certainly the best time for the business of my gallery. And also, more than the business of the gallery, what the gallery was doing, because there was still a lot of great work that was available, great photographers who hadn't quite seen their day yet. Now most of them are in history books, but back then they weren't. And the thrill of discovery kept going and going, and I loved that. It was really fun for me to show a lot of these photographers who were not really well known, but had fantastic careers and were great photographers.
That was Howard Greenberg, legendary photography dealer, collector, and champion of photography, giving us a glimpse into the beginnings of his career and some of the defining moments in the history of his gallery. Check the show notes for links to both the Howard Greenberg Gallery and the Association for International Photography Art Dealers. In the next episode of this series, I'll be speaking with Aronika Dawkins, Adelaide Diapena from Polka Gallery, Anna Walker-Skillman from Jackson Fine Art, and Yancey Richardson, 4 trailblazing female leaders in photography and their contributions to the field. If you want to be the first to hear new episodes, then please subscribe to Subtext Discourse Art World podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you know someone else interested in the overlap of photography and the art world, please send them a link to the show. Podcasting is obviously a broadcast medium, however I'm happy for listeners to reach out. You're welcome to follow me on Threads, Instagram, Blue Sky, LinkedIn at Michael Dooney. Otherwise, you can also go to my website, www.michaeldooney.net. There you'll also find the International Photo Festival database I put together, as well as my webinar for photographers and artists working with lens-based media to better understand the art market and get their work into galleries. I think that's everything. Thanks again for tuning in. My name's Michael Dooney, and you've been listening to Subtext and Discourse.